When morning broke, Gerald awoke. Fortunately, Jeffer had slept some, though he'd had trouble for obvious reasons. With a long yawn, Gerald looked over to Jeffer, who was sitting with his hand around his legs. His teeth were chattering. Cold? Gerald jested. Freezing, Jeffer said. He was a thin boy, though strong and yet to grow a beard, so the cold had likely gone through him faster than Gerald, who was much brawnier. Gerald nodded. They will take us out there soon, Gerald gestured outside of the holding cell. Yeah, Jeffer said, trying not to sound nervous. You fought before, Gerald asked, noting Jeffer's nervousness. It will only be practice, just... Gerald paused a moment. Don't stare at Ripper. The big guy, Jeffer asked. Gerald nodded. The one with the scars. Jeffer gulped, probably thinking of the scars and how Ripper had won them. Right. Gerald continued, You've fought in the Western lands. Not all of the men had. Some of the reinforcements who had come at a later time. The later few had never seen a battle, though some had. Yes, said Jeffers. How many times? Gerald asked, anticipating a bad answer. Once, said. Gerald breathed out, almost angrily, staring forward, his arms stretched out in front of him over his knees. Which battle? Lightwainer. Gerald nodded, somewhat reassured. Then you have fought. But once, Jeffer replied. If you survived Lightwainer, Gerald said, you can survive this. Can? May, Gerald said. Fight well, he added hesitantly, and do what I do as close as you can. There was a silent moment. Do you have sons? Jeffer asked. A girl, said Gerald, and my wife, he said without laughing. Jeffer nodded. Are they? Gerald nodded. I don't know, but if they aren't, they're long gone from here by now, Gerald said, thinking to leave it at that, but then added, and I will never see them again. Jeffer nodded. I'm sorry. No, Gerald said. Focus. Jeffer breathed in a long breath, a nervous breath, and then exhaled. What are you focusing on? Gerald said. The sword, Jeffer said. Almost immediately, the sword, Gerald nodded. In a few moments, Jeffer's guardsmen, 2 of them, came to Gerald and Jeffer's holding cell. When they arrived, they greeted them ostensibly. Gerald smirked, but they did not react to it, and they did not poke any fun at Jeffer. Instead, they marched them down to the square, where Gerald had seen Ripper the day prior. The other men who were already there, some of them, and some filed in behind Gerald and Jeffer. When they were in line, they were instructed to pair into 2 groups, one on the left side of the square, one on the right. On the right side of the square, there were various training tools. Wooden posts planted into the ground and dummies filled with sand, and some wooden posts lying on the ground as well. The ground itself was made of a fine material, which did not hurt to walk on, though it would heat up as the day passed on. Gerald knew, as he was not entirely unfamiliar with it. Jeffer was. What is this? Jeffer asked. Sand, Gerald nearly barked beneath his breath. One of the guardsmen, presumably the head's guardsman, began to speak. You will all strip naked, he said, and put these on. The other guards, there were about 10 of them, threw down on the ground in front of them a set of clothes for each of them. Pants, shoes, and a tunic, all black in color. They did what they were told to do. Jeffer undressed and put on his clothing, tunic included, of which the heat permeated. The rest did the same. He knew that the darker the color, the hotter one became, but it did not bother him. Fighting in the Western lands had been much harder, and despite his brawny build, he ignored the heat with great resistance. Jeffer was not so skilled, and he suffered a great deal already from the heat, and despite his attempts to ignore it, he simply could not. He was sweating. Gerald shook his head, thinking the boy a dead man for the moment. Line up, the head guardsman yelled. He was a tall, brawny man like Gerald, though larger. Gerald only grinned at him as he yelled, though he did fall in line, as he was not stupid. It would not die stupidly. Swords, the head guardsman yelled. Swords, the other guards yelled back, throwing a blunt training sword in front of each fighter. They clanked as they fell, and Gerald yet grinned. The head guardsman took notice. Gerald, he said. Gerald did not answer, merely looking at him through his grin, unsurprised that he knew his name, though through tired eyes. The guard surprisingly took notice and shrugged him off, looking away. Gerald cocked his head back in surprise. There were yet some, perhaps, who still felt some sort of allegiance to the Legion, but Gerald was jumping ahead. It could have simply been respect for him, but respect for him was respect for the Legion. It had to be. Gerald's grin had faded as he thought now, and yet perhaps there was hope for him and the rest yet. They would have to survive their training and their subsequent battling in the arena, he knew, but he would. He was confident of this, though admittedly there was some doubt in the back of his mind, and he did wonder to himself quietly, would he survive this? He had fought for many years, yet he had never fought anybody so used to combat as the men who fought there in the arena, who had survived countless fights. Fights that were as real as anything you could conjure in your mind on the battlefield. These men, he knew, some of them, many of them, used to combat, to say the least, and professional killers, to say the most. As was he thought, nodding to himself. And Jeffert? Gerald looked over to Jeffert warily. He stood next to his friend and picked at his torso nervously. Surely, Gerald thought, surely he would die. It was something Gerald dreaded, inexplicably. Perhaps he had seen too many men perish in the battles of the western lands. Maybe he simply enjoyed the boy's company, though he knew him little. Gerald suspected the former, but he knew in his heart that it was because he had yet borne a son, and his wife, now dead presumably, and daughter also dead. All that he had left to care for was this boy. However, he knew that he could not. He would die with him, attempting to keep him alive or something. It was a weakness, something to blot out, something to ignore, and so that's what Gerald did. He turned his head away from Jeffert, picked up the dulled training sword, and after pairing up with a partner, he trained. Admittedly, his partner had been a weak match, not a very good training partner for Gerald, or for anyone really. Gerald knew that he would die soon in the arena, his training partner, for surely he would not last very long. In luck, in the arena, Gerald had heard, luck was only a small factor. In battle, it was a little different. One could lose their head if they were but looking at an enemy in another direction than the direction from which the other enemy's spear was thrown, or sword was swung, or arrow was fired. In the arena, it was often head-on combat, 1-to-1, with nothing between you and your foe but the weapons in each hand, so Gerald knew that he would not last long, this man that he trained with. After a while, they switched partners. Gerald's next partner was a brawny man as well, roughly the same size as he was, and perhaps faster than Gerald even, but Gerald repeatedly outsmarted his maneuvers, making use of all his momentum in such a way that the man constantly tripped. He was outraged, to say the least, and did not take time to learn from his mistakes, though Gerald was not sure that in this scenario he would have taught him much. He wanted as much of an advantage as possible, so he hoped that they would not participate in a team of sorts in the arena. Besides, these training exercises and partners as they were simply a way to cipher out the weak from the strong. Once that was known, Ripper, who, by the way, circled them from above, walking through the hallways that formed a square shape around the training grounds in which they stood, he would know exactly who to invest his time in. Unfortunately, probably, Ripper would not be happy to have Gerald standing where he would, amongst the strong and capable, but he expected this, definitely remembering the scar, which Gerald had given to him years past. The largest scar, the worst of his scars. By the third training partner, Gerald was tired of the play fighting. Decidedly, he called up to Ripper. "Give me a sword, Ripper." Ripper smiled. "You wish to start the killing so soon, Gerald?" "I wish to train." "I see," Ripper said, flexing his muscles involuntarily. In a bit of anger. "Then you will need a real sword." He nodded to one of his guards, who unsheathed one sword and tossed it to Gerald. "The rest of you," Ripper yelled, "you will receive real swords momentarily." "Good," Gerald could hear Jeffert say, to his surprise, who, though he had not paid much attention to his fighting style or form, noted was smiling and seemingly doing okay. Perhaps there was hope for him yet. Unfortunately, Ripper noticed. "Gerald," he called, "you will pair with the boy there." Gerald gulped, and through his tired eyes he nodded. "If I must." "Wait," Ripper called as Gerald walked over to Jeffert. "You will fight him," he said. He almost cooed. "To the death." Gerald gulped. Jeffert looked quickly at Gerald in fear. Looking down, Gerald gripped his sword hard. He nodded. He had made a grave error. "Good," Ripper then said. "Let's begin."